I know we've done episodes about veterans getting disability benefits for mental health conditions, but we wanted to focus on PTSD specifically because how it's evaluated and approached by the VA is slightly different than other psychiatric conditions. So can you talk a little bit just about some of those differences?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things that are very specific to PTSD in the VA world. The normal rule for veterans' disability compensation is there are three factors. You have to show something from the service, an event, an occurrence, a disability, a disease, something.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Hello there. Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for VA disability benefits, subscribe for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome to our podcast. Today we're going to talk about PTSD and who are we? Well, I'm Francis Jackson. This is Kristian Terrison, and we're from the law firm of Jackson and MacNichol, and we're here to talk about veterans' disability benefits. Our firm specializes in getting justice for veterans on their VA disability claims. So what's the show about? Well, it's about getting disability benefits for veterans. And who's it for? Well, obviously it's for veterans. But more than that, this podcast is for people who care about veterans. It doesn't matter whether you're a friend or a relative or just someone in the community who wants to be supportive of veterans. This podcast is for you.
All right. Well, I know we've done episodes about veterans getting disability benefits for mental health conditions, but we wanted to focus on PTSD specifically because how it's evaluated and approached by the VA is slightly different than other psychiatric conditions. So can you talk a little bit just about some of those differences?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things that are very specific to PTSD in the VA world. The normal rule for veterans' disability compensation is there are three factors. You have to show something from the service, an event, an occurrence, a disability, a disease, something. You have to show a current disability. In this case, we're talking about PTSD specifically. And you have to show a medical linkage or nexus between those two things. But the VA treats PTSD differently than other mental health claims. Ordinarily, with any mental health claim, depression, bipolar disorder, whatever it is, the VA just goes through those three factors I just gave you: something in the service, current problem, medical connection. With PTSD, the VA does a couple of things differently. The biggest thing that they do is they require specific documentation of a stressor that was incurred while the person was in the military. And it has to be a stressor that the medical folks recognize as of sufficient severity to cause PTSD. Often that would be combat with the enemy. You know, we have lots of folks from Vietnam with PTSD who were subjected to rocket or mortar attacks at the base they were stationed at, saw fellow service members seriously injured or killed, saw helicopter crashes, you know, other life-threatening kinds of events. But for PTSD, there has to be a specific notation somewhere in the records that shows this event happened. You can't just describe it. And for purposes of this discussion, we are putting aside the special rule about things that happen in combat that has a slightly different way of operating. But generically, PTSD, you have to have a specific stressor proven. And that's often a problem. You know, there are many things that escape military record keeping, so that can be an issue. The second specific piece about PTSD is, if you will, a subset of PTSD where the claim arises in the context of a sexual assault. The VA has a very specific provision that examiners and adjudicators can look at surrounding circumstances, if you will. They can look at, did this person suddenly have a dramatic decline in performance? Did they suddenly become subject to various kinds of military discipline for infractions? Did they suddenly start using substances? Is there something that shows some dramatic change in this person consistent in time with the sexual assault that was said to have occurred? So those are the two big kind of specific pieces to PTSD that distinguish them from other kinds of mental health issues.
Okay. Now, is a formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder necessary to begin the claim process? Or, can a veteran who's experiencing symptoms they think are PTSD initiate a claim still?
It's the latter. There is no requirement at the beginning of the process for a specific diagnosis. A veteran can go to the VA and make a claim and say, I'm having symptoms, I think it's PTSD. As long as you fill out the claim form and do the other formalities to start the claim, that's sufficient. You don't have to have a diagnosis. What will happen is that in most of those cases, so long as the VA thinks there is a reasonable basis for the claim, is they will set up a compensation and pension exam, or C&P exam. And the examiner there will provide a diagnosis, whether it's PTSD or whether you have a situation where, as often happens, the examiner says, I don't think this qualifies as PTSD, but I think there is this other one or more DSM-5 diagnoses that apply here, whether it's depression or anxiety or specific trauma disorder or schizophrenia or whatever it is, the examiner will typically advance a diagnosis. If you have a claim where the VA decides not to get a C&P exam, then at some point you will have to get a diagnosis from an appropriate mental health professional. But normally the VA, as part of their duty to assist in these claims, will provide an exam and a diagnosis.
And I wanted to mention something that I've unfortunately seen a number of times in the cases I've worked on, is where somebody will apply for PTSD, they go to the C&P exam, the C&P examiner, for whatever reason, stops short of a PTSD diagnosis, but says there's severe depression and anxiety, for instance, and the regional office takes that C&P and they turn around and they say, your claim for PTSD is denied. And that's the end of it. And can you talk a little bit about what the problem is when that happens?
Sure. Well, the VA is not supposed to do that. That's the problem. But more specifically, there's a case from the Veterans Court, the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, a few years ago, that very specifically says that the VA's practice of having someone apply for PTSD or any other mental condition and then getting an exam that says, well, they don't have that condition, they've got something else, and using that as a basis to deny the claim is not appropriate. The VA is supposed to look at the symptoms, not the diagnostic label, but the symptoms, and determine whether or not the person is suffering from those symptoms, and if so, what the correct diagnostic label is. It's not up to a veteran who probably doesn't have any great expertise in mental health to self-diagnose. It's up to the VA to take the information from the veteran and use that to determine what the proper diagnosis is. And then, what was missing in your example, go the next step and say, okay, it's not PTSD, it's actually depression or anxiety or both, but it is related to service, and here's how. And unfortunately, as you point out, notwithstanding the case law from the court, the VA sometimes does not have the examiner go that second step. They just say, oh, well, the examiner didn't find PTSD, goodbye, when in fact, the examiner found some other condition that was in fact related to service, but didn't explain that relationship.
Now, when it comes to verifying the stressors, what types of steps does the VA take to verify?
The VA contacts another military organization within DoD, Department of Defense, and asks them to try to get records relating to the event that the veteran has specified as a stressor. Sometimes there are multiple events, but the VA's obligation is to contact the military and try to get a report establishing that whatever this event was occurred. The problem is that sometimes, for whatever reasons, the military just doesn't come up with the records. We had a case that Alexandra handled where it's a World War II veteran. He explained that his PTSD came from an incident where he was on a Navy ship, an accompanying ship was torpedoed and sunk, and his participation involved rescuing sailors from the water and taking bodies out of the water. The VA said they hadn't been able to get the military to verify it. Alexandra went on the military's own history site and got pictures of the ship that he was on, the sinking ship, with the caption that the folks on his ship were rescuing the sailors from the sinking ship, and submitted it. Not surprisingly, he was granted shortly after that. But, you know, that's not the only example. And I've got one now that we're working on where a gentleman was stationed in Alaska. And it's significant that he was in Alaska because it's so cold, they had to leave the equipment running. They couldn't turn it off or it would freeze up. So in the site he was at, these folks are outdoors in tents, you know, cold weather tents, but tents. And they leave the equipment running. One of the pieces they leave running is a bulldozer. And the vibration knocks it out of park or whatever the thing is on a bulldozer, and it starts moving. And it literally crushed another veteran in front of our veteran. We have the actual newspaper clippings from the event, from the newspaper there in Alaska. But the VA has not been able to verify it with the military, which is just crazy. I mean, it will eventually get verified, and he will get his benefits, but the delay is just beyond ridiculous.
Well, and I was working on one case where the traumatic event happened in service, but other than it happening in service, it was unrelated to military action. It was a service member who was stationed in Germany, had emergency medical responder training, and witnessed a civilian accident. And were getting bodies out of a wrecked bus and things like that had traumatized them. And there was no U.S. military record of that having happened. And so we were completely reliant on media reports, contemporaneous media reports, and also buddy statements. Folks he had been with at the time, and then folks who had seen the change in him after this effort. So even when the VA is saying they can't verify it, there are ways and options.
There are sometimes, I don't mean to suggest that it becomes impossible, but it is extremely frustrating sometimes that the VA is so slow to accept the other evidence when it's indisputable that this happened.
Are there any other challenges that veterans face that are unique to substantiating a PTSD claim? We've talked a lot about the stressor piece, but...
Well, I mean, once you have the stressor proven, it's mostly a question of, do the medical folks, the examining psychologists or psychiatrists who do the C&P exams, agree that the stressor was of sufficient severity to cause the PTSD? You know, we had one case, very sad. The gentleman recently died. That, of course, was the end of his case, but the case had been up to the court several times. It involved whether or not there was a sufficient stressor, and the psychologist that the VA repeatedly assigned to look at this claim just kept saying different things. The first time, this psychologist was part of a panel of two that reported that he had PTSD and talked about the circumstances. The second time, she said, well, he doesn't have PTSD. He has, I think she said anxiety. Don't hold me to that, but I think that was it. The third time, she said, well, really, it's a personality disorder. And as it was being sent back the fourth time over a, I think, 13-year period, he died. Just very frustrating. But fortunately, that's not a usual set of circumstances, but it happens.
When giving a disability rating to PTSD, what does the VA look at, and is it different from other mental health conditions?
The last half of that's easy. It is not different than other mental health conditions. What the VA looks at are the criteria from their general schedule for rating mental health disabilities. And they look at a whole series of things, but primarily the point of what they look at is to determine the level of what they call occupational impairment, meaning are you able to work or not? And if you are able to work, is your ability to work impaired to some degree or diminished? And there are lots of factors that they look at, but some of the big ones in PTSD tend to be ability to get along with others. Folks with PTSD in particular, among the various mental health conditions, have a lot of difficulty as a rule getting along with other folks. They just can't tolerate very much interaction, particularly negative interaction, criticism, conflict. Those, they just can't deal with those at all in a lot of cases. They tend to isolate themselves. And one of the factors, of course, that the VA always looks at in mental health cases is whether there's suicidal ideation, meaning are you thinking about suicide? Not necessarily that you have an active plan, but you think, well, you know, the world might be better off if I wasn't here tomorrow. And so that's a factor that they particularly look for.
What steps should a veteran take if they believe they got a lowball rating for their PTSD?
The only thing I have found effective in terms of ratings is to have a private evaluation and have that person talk about the level of symptoms, the type of symptoms, and the impact in terms of what the VA calls social and occupational impairment. We've had pretty good success with getting private evaluations as to the severity of mental health conditions generally and PTSD in particular. It's not always perfect. I mean, we've certainly had cases where the adjudicator or the board said, you know, I like our report better than your report, and, you know, we're not going to give you an increase. But by and large, a thorough, competently done evaluation of the severity of the condition will often result in getting an appropriate rate.
And how about in cases where PTSD or the symptoms or a symptom exacerbation sort of happens years after service? How would a veteran in that situation prove service connection?
Well, you have to prove service connection the same old way in every case. I mean, you've got to show that something happened in service, although they say that more carefully. What you have to prove is either that the condition existed while a person was in service, or that some event or occurrence in service led to it. It is not at all unusual with PTSD for folks who are not getting treated to get worse. As with most conditions, you know, untreated conditions tend to get worse. I don't care if you're talking about PTSD or the injury to your leg, you know, they just tend to get worse without treatment. So what happens a lot in PTSD cases is that people serve sometimes in horrific circumstances. They come back and they kind of contain the problem for a while. But over time, it sort of leaks out and they start to show more symptoms. Their symptoms get worse. And I think this is just my observation. I've never had a psychiatrist tell me this, but I'm pretty sure it's true that as people age, they tend to get less flexible, more rigid. It's more difficult for them to deal with any problem, whether it's PTSD or something else. So the symptoms tend to become more florid. And so it's not at all uncommon to see situations where people kind of got along sort of okay for a period of time after service, sometimes for a significant period of time. And then it just kind of gets worse and more people who are around them see it. You know, if you're not around someone all the time and they're having mental health symptoms, it may not be obvious for a while, but if you're around them often enough for long enough, it kind of leaks through. They can't hide it. And so I think those things tend to lead to claims being made later on, sometimes years after service. But coming back to your underlying question about how do you prove that, all you can do is get a careful, thorough report from an expert explaining how what happened led to this progression of symptoms that is now at the level we're looking at.
All right. We're just about out of time for today. I didn't know if you had any last thoughts on PTSD or advice for our viewers regarding applying for PTSD.
I do. In light of Clemens, the case I was mentioning earlier that says that the VA has to focus on the symptoms and not the diagnostic label, I think anytime someone is struggling with mental health symptoms that they think started with or began in the service, they should make a claim. It's much easier to pull the pieces together and push toward favorable result on the claim over time than to have it all wrapped up in a neat ball at the beginning. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that VA benefits are not retroactive in the sense that if you filed a claim today, your eligibility doesn't actually start until the first full day of the first full month after you make the claim. So if you've had symptoms for 5 years and you haven't filed a claim, the VA can't go back and pay you for those 5 years. But if you file the claim today, even if it takes another 5 years to get it all sorted out and convince the VA, get all the proof in place and get granted, they can pay you for that 5-year period after you file the claim. So the important part, if you're having symptoms and you think they're related to service, you need to file the claim. The worst that'll happen is ultimately you can't prove it and you're no worse off financially than you were before. But if you don't file the claim and you wait years, you will be worse off financially because you could have gotten paid for those years and you weren't able to because you withheld filing the claim. That's my advice.
All right. So file today. If you're holding back or on the fence, just get it in and get it done so that clock can start ticking.
That's exactly right. So thank you for watching and see us next week.
Be sure to subscribe. Take care.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.